A reading from the book of Acts, beginning in the 17th chapter and the 16th verse. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace, day by day, with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, maybe is a better pronunciation, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man that he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, we're going to talk about church and culture as our sort of topic for our chapels during this year. And this is in line with our new church and culture series of conferences that we're going to be doing over the next several years. And we have a new center, a church and culture center, and they're going to be doing various events. So this is going to be kind of a central focus, at least for this year, and in some of the events that we're going to be looking at in the time to come. But in the meantime, in chapel, we're going to have various perspectives on this whole notion of church and culture. And I'm myself looking forward to this because I'm not sure what I'm going to hear when I hear these different sermons or talks from my colleagues or from others who will be coming to speak here. Because when we touch on the notion of culture, we introduce a lot of different things, don't we? When you think about culture, there are a lot of variables there that are rather hard to predict. However, I think we would all agree that culture is inescapable. It's everywhere, to the point that we don't even know that it's around us, or we don't even know that it's influencing us. Now, it was around during the biblical times as well. It's also influenced the interpretation of the Bible through the ages. Culture is one of those things, a bit like air, right? It's around us all the time. We don't think of it maybe all the time, but if it weren't there, you would certainly notice the difference. But one of the big questions is, what is culture? What is culture? Well, I said that there was something like air. So some of you will think of it like a kind of a backdrop, right? A bit like a backdrop on a stage, a background against which everything plays itself out. Maybe it's something like that. Or is it much more active? Is it kind of a force? Is it at play in everything that we do? In that sense, is culture more of an active participant? Here you are, and here is your culture with you at the same time. Now, if it is an active participant, however, when we think of it that way, where is culture located? Is it in the individuals? Or is it in the sum of all of the individuals? Or is it something still more abstract, something kind of that connects individuals together without really being in any given one of them fully? Now, some of you will be familiar with, and I hesitate to bring it up, but I will. Some of you will be familiar with systemic functional linguistics because a few of us around here have something to do with it. Now, in systemic functional, this is not going to be a lesson in systemic functional linguistics as much as Ambrose would like to be, as I just heard from his reaction to my bringing it up. That cheer that went up when he said, "Oh boy, this is going to be great. I'm glad I came today." No, we're not going to go into that, but I'll abbreviate my comments because in SFL, the idea of the context of culture is a very important concept. It's a concept in this linguistic model. However, it's also one of the least well-defined ideas in the whole thing. In fact, it is very poorly defined. And it's, in fact, maybe one of the most poorly defined concepts in the whole idea of SFL. Most linguists who use FL don't even try to define what it is. And when they do, they come up with all sorts of different things that talk about, maybe it has something to do with background knowledge that people have. Maybe it's various schemas or certain kinds of frames that people operate within, or it's a variety of other things that people talk about. Well, if it's difficult to define in a linguistic model where it's sort of central, you can imagine it's probably fairly difficult to pin down if we're talking about it in a more lay context. In fact, like a lot of things, culture may not be possible to define, but as sort of the language goes, we know it when we see it, or at least we know it because there are elements of it that we see, and we see how they influence us. And it has a role to play in our world and in the world of the Bible. So what does that mean? Well, it sometimes means we're integrated into culture, we're a part of culture, but it also means that we may be at odds sometimes with our culture, and we may be contrary to culture. Because culture is probably not just a single or singular thing, but it's many different things. And so it's probably both kind of a thing we're integrated into, but that we also stand in some kind of tension with both views probably having some kind of an element of truth to them. We can't be fully apart from culture. It's hard to imagine what that would be like, sort of the person who exists without any ties to anything. But we should also be wary if we are in fact indistinguishable from culture, or we allow culture to drive or to motivate or to control or in some way to dominate who we are and everything that we think and we believe. Paul says in Romans 12:2 that we're to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, but not conformed to the world. Now, this episode, thank you, Ambrose, for reading it, the episode that Paul there in Athens, it's a well-known passage, but it's also, I think, a very important and well-known passage about how sort of the church, through Paul, meets culture. It was the passage probably that Tertullian had in mind when he asked, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Now, I'm not quite sure that I would have formulated it quite the same way that Tertullian did, and nor would I have used it in the same way as many people have used it since that time. But he did, and there we have it, and that's the way it's been formulated. But here we have Paul, who in fact was not a Jerusalemite, there in Athens. And we see this in Acts 17. And so let's make a few observations about this passage. Now, I have 15 observations to make about the passage of Paul. I said 15 so that you think, oh my goodness, 15. It's actually only 5. Now you think 5's not so bad, right? Compared to the number that I was. It's 5 observations about Paul in Athens. The first one is that Paul observes culture. Paul observes culture. If you look in Acts 17, 16 to 17, you see that Paul is there in Athens. He has kind of the equivalent of a layover, I guess, in traveling these days. He has a little bit of a layover there in Athens. He's looking around at Athens. He's observing, right? He doesn't just jump in. He's observing. He observes, and he's distressed by what he sees, because he sees that the city there is full of idols, various things erected to various gods, various places of worship, all sorts of different things that reflect idolatry. And so he's engaged in reasoning in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearers. So Jews were in the synagogue as a place of gathering that also went along with reading of scripture and worship, but also God-fearers, those Gentiles who looked at the Jews, respected a lot of the moral teachings, perhaps the fact that they had a single God who was revelatory to them through scripture. They didn't want to become fully Jewish, but they wanted to fear God. They're there. Paul also, though, doesn't confine himself just to observing in the synagogue, but he's out there in the marketplace, in the agora. He's out there and he's meeting with others. He's observing. In other words, Paul observed culture to find out what it was like. What is this thing, Athenian culture? And so he's going to make some observations by observing and looking, not judging yet, but observing. He observes this, he discusses, he debates with others in order to make sure his observations have some validity. He does this with a variety of different people. He doesn't talk with people who are of his own group or those that he thinks will necessarily say the things that he wants to hear. He observes, he debates, he formulates as a result an opinion. The second is that Paul confuses culture in Acts 17, 18 to 21. Now, one of the things is that Paul comes into contact with Epicureans and Stoics, and they want to debate with him as well. And that's very understandable. You see in this passage here, it talks about Athenians who were, what they love to do is just kind of debate different ideas. They are kind of on an endless graduate school program, right? And so they are debating various things. They enjoy that. The Athenians were well known for this. Athens was a great intellectual center of the ancient world and had been so for half a millennium. Okay, can you imagine any other place that's been a half a millennium as an intellectual center? All the way since classical times, down even into the Hellenistic period, it was a major center of engagement with ideas and debate. And here was a guy who apparently had some ideas. They liked that. Let's engage with him and figure out some of these ideas. And the Epicureans and Stoics were, in fact, two of the leading philosophical schools of the time. And there's a lot of things that we can say about the Epicureans and the Stoics. In fact, the Stoics, some would argue, even go back as a group, seeing themselves traced back to Socrates. Okay, so if you know anything about Socrates, this figure that Plato writes a lot about, Xenophon does too, but this philosopher, this whole method of talking and debate and dialogue and teasing things out through conversation. They go back, they like this idea of the Socratic method. But what distinguishes both the Epicureans and the Stoics, and we may not think about this today, we may think of them as sort of abstract philosophers, is that they were both materialists. They were both materialists, even if they were materialists in different ways. The Epicureans, they focused on materialism so much so that they came to be identified later with an overemphasis upon it. So most of us probably think of Epicureans as people who are just interested in satisfying desires in some way. But that's because they emphasized the material world so much. But the Stoics, they also focused upon material substance. They believed that there was this pervasive thing, you could call it maybe the rational principle, sometimes described as the logos, that was interwoven with everything in the universe. They were both materialists. That's their metaphysics. That's what they believed really existed, material stuff. They clearly did not understand Paul. They did not understand Paul. They accused him of introducing foreign gods. Now, they would probably know something about this because this is a place full of all sorts of gods, not all of them native to Athens. If you know anything about the Greek and the Roman pantheon, it was a hodgepodge of gods who were gathered from all over the place. Some of them came from the Near East. Some of them came from Asia. Some of them came from rocks. If they saw something, they could make a god out of it. So they accused Paul of introducing foreign gods. We have all these gods, now you're bringing some new gods. Now, it may have been simply that they were materialists and Paul was not. And he didn't reduce everything down simply to material substance. It may also have been that they thought he was introducing some new gods, one named Jesus and the other called resurrection, right? Jesus, we know that. But the word for resurrection, the Greek word anastasis, sounds like a feminine word that could be made into a god. In fact, that's the way the ancients did a lot of things, right? Like that. They would basically confuse, right, things with beings, and then beings became gods. And that's when I joked a little bit earlier about rocks, right? Worship a rock, and before you know it, you've got some whole big thing created. So maybe Anastasis is new God. Not quite sure who she is. Haven't heard about her before. Paul, tell me about this. But Paul had mentioned Jesus and the resurrection. So Paul's metaphysics, however, was completely different because his was grounded not in just material being, but it was grounded in Jesus and Jesus' resurrection. And the notion of resurrection was a contentious one in ancient Greek thought. We don't need to go into it here, but they did believe in it, but they were not altogether clear on what it entailed. But Paul is speaking of it as if it's the basis of everything. But they wanted to know more from Paul because his observations, what he was saying, was clearly at odds with theirs. Paul was bringing strange things to their ears. And of course, they kind of liked the idea of something new and different that they could debate. But this may have been a challenge to that same old logos philosophy that they like to think about. So Paul confused their culture because he did not fit within it. He was at odds with them because of the very foundations of their thought. His foundations were different. and their differences pointed up the contrast between him and them. The third point is that Paul critiques culture. Paul critiques culture. We see that in verses 22 and 23. Paul sees that the Athenians were very religious. Depends on the translation here. Some would say very religious or perhaps even superstitious. In some ways, it doesn't really matter. In other words, they had plenty of gods. It was not that these were pagans who had no gods whatsoever. They were full of gods. If you ever get to go to the Acropolis, I notice now that they're limiting the number of tourists who can go there. So only is about 40,000 a day who can go now these days. But you get to the Acropolis and you can see all these different temples erected to different gods all over the place. So there was not a problem of not having enough gods. They were clearly religious people. They were worshiping all sorts of things, but they were worshiping the wrong things. Notice that they had so many different gods that they wanted to be sure that they had covered all their bases. Because, of course, you have a God who's the God of the sky. You have a God of the water. You have a God of light. You have the God of fire. You have a God of this. What if we left one out? Maybe there's the God of the something we didn't think of. And so let's have an altar to the God who is unknown to us. Pausanias, the 2nd century AD geographer and traveler, he in fact refers to this idea of an altar to unknown gods in the plural. It's interesting to think that they just didn't think there was one they may have missed. They wanted to really cover their bases. There were many of them out there. So this is to the unknown. Don't be offended, gods out there. We've got one for you, even though we don't know your name. Okay? So Paul is in this environment. Now, we're probably familiar with the fact that in some contemporary studies or surveys, they like to talk about many people, especially people of a younger generation. I don't know why the younger generation always has to get singled out for this, whatever that younger generation is. They're being not formally religious anymore, but they're still spiritual. And that's a good justification for business as usual or something. But I wonder if that's not a good way of describing the Athenians. The Athenians were spiritual, which is another way of saying they weren't really clear in their minds what they believed. They weren't sure who their gods were. They had plenty of them, but they seemed to think they needed more. They knew there was something more. They knew there was something other. They knew there was something out there. They couldn't quite pin it down. So they were into various forms of worship and objects of their belief. But what does Paul say in response to that? Does he say that this spirituality is a good thing, so let's count them in the good people category when we do our surveys? Well, we don't need to despair, because even though people say we don't need to despair, because even though people don't believe anymore, at least they're spiritual. Well, we probably all wish that Paul would have endorsed that idea. Wouldn't life be simpler? He does not. Paul says they are ignorant of the very thing that they worship. They're ignorant. Paul says they are unknowing, unthinking. They haven't got a clue. Fourth is that Paul contradicts culture. We see this in Acts 17, 24 to 31. So Paul explains himself. He says he's going to clarify for them why he says this, and he does. Paul doesn't hesitate to point out that his metaphysics is different from theirs. But more than that, so is his epistemology. His epistemology is grounded in revelation of God and not in humans groping after things as if they are in a dark room. That's a different epistemology. And Paul encapsulates God's creation of humanity. And this is what God's revelation is that God made the world and everything in it. But he's not a part of it. He's not one of the rocks and trees that we worship. He does not hang out in these temples that are made by human beings. And he's not served by them when we bring our offerings and burn things so that the fragrances will be pleasing to the gods. He is not the response of humans. As humans bring the gods to life when they worship stones or whatever it is. He, in fact, is the one that gives life to humans. Paul says here, from one man, and yes, Paul probably did believe in one man named Adam. He made all of humanity to inhabit the world in various places with their boundaries appointed by him. Some people sometimes wonder about the longevity of empires. This passage makes it clear. The boundaries have already been marked out. God knows. Nations are coming, nations are falling. It's all been marked out by him. Why? We think, well, maybe it's to cause the kind of strife and opposition and conflict that humans have ended up in about all of these boundaries. No, Paul says that's not why he did it. He did it so that human beings would seek after him. And perhaps, the way it's phrased here, perhaps, it's not certain, but perhaps they would reach out for him and they would find him, even though he's in fact not far from anyone who does so. He's right there if people are able and willing to reach out. Paul says, for in God we live and move and have our being. That's a great verse, isn't it? For in God we live and move and have our being. Our very being is because of our existence in God. God is not other, and we are not other from God. In God we have our very being. And at this point, Paul cites the 3rd century BC poet Aratus. You notice it says the poets, probably because Aratus is reflecting language that is found in Cleanthes' hymn to Zeus, if you want to follow that up. But in his Phenomena, Aratus says we are his offspring. We come out of God in some way. Paul appropriates this passage from the Greek poet. So what are we to make of this? Now, did Paul spend his time reading Aratus? It's possible. It is entirely possible that he did. It's been shown, and I think this is contrary to what a lot of scholars want to think, that Paul's language is full of the language of ancient Greek writers. Full of it. To paraphrase slightly, Paul was a reader of the world, even if he was not fully part of it. So what would be the equivalent today? Well, perhaps if we were thinking about how we would describe our culture and drawing on some of the ancient writers, the venerated writers, we'd maybe invoke, if we want to respect the time period, some 17th century poet, such as John Milton, who attempted to justify the ways of God to man in his work called Paradise Lost. Or perhaps you'd look at a sonnet of John Donne, also from the 17th century. Thou hast made me, and shall thy works decay? Repair me now, for now mine end doth haste. I run to death, and death meets me as fast, and all my pleasures are like yesterday. But perhaps in our climate, such poetry is a little too religious, right? That sounds a little bit too much. Although, doesn't Aratus sound a little bit religious, right? We are God's offspring. We need something that maybe captures our culture a little more realistically. Well, one of the poets that I think has provided one of the greatest cultural critiques of the contemporary world was a poet named T.S. Eliot. You're probably all familiar with T.S. Eliot, but for those who are not, he was an interesting person. He came from a good Boston family, although he himself was born in St. Louis, Missouri. You can imagine. He was born in St. Louis. He did his undergraduate degree at Harvard. He did an MA in English at Harvard. And then he did a PhD in philosophy at Harvard and wrote his dissertation on the philosopher F.H. Bradley. And he never defended it. Not recommended, if you want to get the PhD, that you not show up for the Viva. But he didn't. He actually ran off to Britain and spent the rest of his life there. And he did a great job, I think, of capturing what it was like, what it's like to be a person in the contemporary world. And I didn't mention this, but he also ended up winning the Nobel Prize for Literature, basically for writing all the material that's in this book. You think of all the books you've read, or maybe the books you've written, you think, he didn't write that much to get the Nobel Prize, but there it is. It's because he wrote things like this. And let me just read a couple. I won't read all of his poetry to you, but I'll read a couple of things that I think capture, if we're trying to describe the culture that we're in, there are people who have done that, and it provides an example for us of what that world is like. And Eliot captured it so well. This is a poem called The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And I'm not going to read all of it, but it starts out like this. It says, "Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table." Now there's an image of the world for you. A patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. If you know this poem, you know it proceeds from here, talking about the fog that pervades, and uses a number of images. He talks about, this basically is the description of a contemporary human being who is basically caught up in the kind of world weariness and tiredness of what life is about, and contemplating how basically even small decisions end up being monumental decisions. And indeed, there will be time to wonder, do I dare? And do I dare? Time to turn back and descend the stair with a bald spot in the middle of my hair. They will say, how his hair is growing thin. My morning coat, my collar mounting firmly to the chin, my necktie rich and modest, but asserted by a simple pin. They will say, but how his arms and legs are thin. Do I dare disturb the universe? In a minute there is time for decisions and revisions, which a minute will reverse. He doesn't dare to disturb the universe. He's not even sure how to part his hair. He gets all upset in this poem about trying to eat a peach. And so this is really a description of the modern predicament. Some of you will be familiar with one of his great poems. That was a great poem, but a poem called The Wasteland. The Wasteland, which is really sort of the emblematic poem of the 20th century in the West. The Wasteland. The title itself tells you what this is about. The Wasteland. It starts by saying April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Some of you will be familiar with Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. You know that April is the month when pilgrims go on pilgrimages. And what has happened in the intervening centuries? April has become the cruelest month. Paul says that we are God's offspring, and that God is not made of gold or silver or stone, a human image. He commands every person to repent because he has established a day of universal judgment proven by the resurrection. A real contrast to the idea of debating how you're going to part your hair, whether you're going to eat a peach, or whether you're going to go get enough courage to talk to a woman while they're talking about Michelangelo. Paul contradicts culture. But note that he uses culture to make his critique. Interestingly enough, T.S. Eliot wrote that poem, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, when he was 23 years old. There was a person who was weary before his time. And fifth and finally, Paul redeems culture. In Acts 17, 32 to 34, most see the conclusion of Paul's confrontation with the Epicureans and the Stoics as a colossal and complete failure. Paul is interrupted when he mentions the resurrection, and he's shut down. Some of them want to blow him off completely, but others dismiss him by saying, oh, we'll hear you some other time. You know, our attention span's pretty short. Forget it. We don't want to hear about this anymore. And that must have been very disappointing to Paul. However, there was a still small voice. Some of the people, Luke says, became followers and believed, including some others as well. Luke mentions two by name: Dionysius, the Areopagite, who would have been a leader of the group that gathered there, and Damaris, a woman. A man and a woman by name. Was it a failure by Paul because he didn't accommodate to culture or join culture, but he critiqued it instead? I guess it depends on how you define failure. Those who believed probably didn't think of it that way. Now, we don't know what happened to Dionysius the Areopagite or Damaris. We note that Dionysius is named after the god of wine and partying, of all things, but some, by rumor and church tradition, say he became one of the first bishops of Athens. But we know far less about Damaris. What we do know is that Christianity became implanted in Greece, and it remains there to this day. And the same cannot be said about the Epicureans and the Stoics. Let's pray. Father, we're thankful for the opportunity we have to come before you, to open your word at the beginning of this year, and to contemplate this vast topic of what it means for those who are your followers to live in culture, to confront culture, to be a part of culture, to speak to culture. And Lord, as we look forward to this year, we're going to be given opportunities in various ways to think about this and to live this out and to act and react. And I pray, Lord, that as we contemplate these things, you will guide us in your truth, and you will guide us in your will and your way, so that we will be able to be more faithful servants of your word to the world around us. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.